Paul Shepard years ago wrote a book, Nature and Madness. This is insane what we're doing. We're sick, we're diseased. But this is also the shifting baseline problem. We're born into this world and we think this is normal. And we can say, well, it's sad, it's unfortunate that people have all these illnesses, but that's just the way it is. And it's not the way it is. It's not the way it has to be. It's the way that we've adapted. And in the adaptations, we are suffering. So when you ask the question, about adaptation, we have to ask, well, what's the baseline? And is it just in our lifetime, or is it based on who we are and who we can be?
I really appreciate your time. I mean, the more I delve into your work, look, the essays you sent me, even more than I knew there was. I love all the stuff you're about, and you're a man of you're a professor. You do things officially, and the way you do them is much needed in the world. I think it's an important time. Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure you've been talking about this stuff for a long time, but I've only caught wind of your stuff in the last couple of years, and hopefully it's doing, more. It's doing a lot of good now, because you have been talking about this for a fair amount of years, I'm sure. But for me, the power of technology, as I'm sure we can get into, the good and the bad. It's doing wonders. We're talking across the world and spreading your knowledge and your research and your studies, and it's awesome. I'm so glad you're giving me your time. So first of all, I thought I'd ask you, just, obviously we've never met before, we've never spoke, but why do you think I've got you onto the podcast? It's always a good question.
Something about technology, world change, radical transformation of life, human survival, evolution, biophilia, love and laughter.
Yeah, great. Good summary. Some great bullet points. Yeah, awesome.
That was free association.
So you're still professor at University of Washington. Is that still what you're doing now?
I am. Yeah, I'm in the Department of Psychology and also in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. So I'm able to kind of span those two disciplines of psychology and nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what part did nature play in kind of your upbringing and your where you've come from? Was it a significant thing, or is it something you've kind of remembered and come back to? Or has it always been there?
Yeah, good question. When I was don't know when to start. I left home when I was 13 years old and went out to Berkeley, California, from New Jersey in the United States. And then that was during the 1960s, late 60s. So civil rights and Vietnam War was raging. So it was a pretty amazing time to be an adolescent coming of age with just tremendous hope and social activism. It was incredible. I thought things were going to keep getting better. I thought, as an adolescent, I just thought it was on an upward trajectory. And I learned a few things as I got older. But when I was 16 years old, I went from Berkeley to a communally run cattle ranch in the mountains of Northern California, 670 acres. So I lived there for 4 years. It was, back in the day then, there was a lot of back to the land interest, especially as focus went from the cities to more land and rural. So I joined that community. I've been part of that community for my entire remaining years, and so I spent 4 years on that land. It was big, wide open country. It was 600, about a square mile, but it was connected to so much You could get on, I mean, I had horses. I would get on horseback. I could ride any direction and go as far and as hard as I could go for days or weeks on end. So I experienced big nature, and I, in some ways, took it for granted. It's some of the deepest living I did, and part of what I've sought to do in years hence is help give voice to some of that, of why it's so deep in our beings, in our evolution, and how we're losing it so quickly. And when we lose it, we're destroying the well springs of our existence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and ourselves at the same
Yeah,
time. We are
yeah,
destroying. We sometimes don't think we are nature, and the one thing I draw upon to people, I'm like, you're an animal, and because sometimes people don't realize that they are one, or they have the same needs, or they have the same desires, and
yeah.
it's quite interesting knowing their reaction, seeing their reaction. But one thing, it happened to me, I think probably a couple of months ago. One thing I want to share with you that I think it was on the news, or it was like a bulletin. It was a BBC news headline, like something about nature, how it lowers your depression, and how it's good for your well-being, and these scientists say so. And I just kept thinking to myself, like, I guess our conversation can start there. Is why do we need science to, like, have we gone so far? It's so disconnected. Why we need science to tell us that it's good for us? You know.
Yes. I became part of that movement, nature and health. Here at the University of Washington, there's a very strong regional group that's going national, tied to nature and health, and I'm part of that. And I suppose I got involved in that group with the same surprise that you just mentioned, which is, are you kidding me? But in fact, to make headway with many types of arguments, it becomes effective. And so it's not the beginning, it's not the end of a nature story, but for some people, it's the beginning of a story, of a way in. And in a scientific culture that has lost such deep connection with nature,
Yeah.
it can be a way for somebody to open themselves up to that possibility. And that's the scientific knowledge. So yeah, I'm involved in that, and part of a review article that Howie Frumpkin led, who is Dean of Public Health here at the University of Washington. And we reviewed 300, 400 articles where it's good for us, in the ways you're highlighting. Lowers depression, increases positive mood, reduces ADHD symptoms, even something like eyesight. If you think of so many of us, like right now, we have about that 2-foot distance between the eyes and the screen, or 18 inches with the phone. And you look at myopia being such a problem worldwide. And part of that is that we're spending too much time with too narrow of a focal point. And what nature does, of course, is it opens it up. It's optimal. So in so many ways, I mean, and this, of course, with your wide breadth of reading, it's like we came of age with nature, and we're so calibrated to the natural world. We're optimally geared to thrive in natural and wild nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have the beauty of looking out my window to ships and boats as they cross the North Sea, and it is a little exercise that I do. Like every 20 minutes, I'll make sure I look up and focus. Yeah. And if you really tune in, you notice how that makes you feel. And the one thing about looking out to vast landscapes, which you only really get when you're in a big vast space, typically in nature, or a viewpoint or something, even over a city, your eyes will relax because it can't concentrate on anything. So
Yeah.
there's nothing to really focus on. So you end up, your retinas start relaxing, which is an amazing thing to to tune into. Yeah, for sure. And yeah, it's there's loads of things we could talk about.
What
The-
are
the-
you what are you especially interested in
I
around
guess the
the
generational amnesia, because I think that's a concept everyone can really tune into, and it affects everyone because it is a
yes.
perspective, isn't it? It's generally something that happens to us. It's just like, let's compare it to the iPhone. You can't go back; you can only go forward. You know, if I've had an iPhone 6 and I went to an iPhone 3, I'd figure, well, something's not right here, and it's kind of like that. I'll let you talk about it as it's your term, but I kind of felt that kind of feeling towards it is when you're born into something and it becomes the new norm, because it is a norm. Then it's impossible to take that step back perspective, you know,
Hmm.
in some degrees, you know. So did you want to just define what you mean by generational?
Environmental
Um,
generational amnesia.
yes, there you go.
It's quite a handful of mouthful. Um, I first started seeing this decades ago in an early study I did in inner city Houston, Texas, in an all-black community. And younger kids, the first and third graders especially that we interviewed, they understood about air pollution, water pollution. They could talk about it. But then when we asked, was Houston polluted? Like, did they think that Houston had the problem of air pollution? Uh, a majority of kids who had said that could talk about air pollution didn't think that Houston had pollution. And at the time, Houston was the most polluted city in the United States. So it kind of blew us away. Like, how could they understand about pollution but not think that they were living in a polluted environment? And that's where the idea started taking hold. And I coined the term back then, which is, and you can see with these kids that if you grow up in an environment where there's already pollution, that becomes not pollution. That's the norm. That's the baseline. And it's like a recalibration. And so the world can keep getting more polluted. Each generation comes of age. And here's the key idea is that when we come of age as kids, we construct a view of the environment, an understanding of the environment, and what is normal. And that normal is already, highly degraded, but we don't think of it as degraded. We're just like the children in Houston. We don't understand how much has been degraded. We calibrate it, we construct notions of normality, and then we start learning things, and we are then told about the environment, that there's such things as pollution and so forth, or that we're missing deep connections with nature, and we can learn that way, and some of that can be effective, but it's on top of this deep experiential knowledge that is just wrong, and that's a really hard problem to overcome. And we all face it in very deep ways, and of course as we get older we start losing places that are very deep to us, and then at that point we start going, oh my goodness, look what we're losing. But it's hard-won knowledge, isn't it? It's hard-won knowledge because we lose it, we gain an understanding of what's happening, we try to explain it to a younger generation, and the younger generation can look at us and say, I don't think I'm missing that much. What exactly is the problem here? And you try to explain it, and they think, well, feels pretty normal to me.
Yeah, they don't know what that feeling. They have no motivation because they don't know what the feeling is to be motivated about.
Right. And it's on the pollution side or the degradation side, but I think as you're just highlighting, it's also on the joyous beauty side.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've seen this even in the community I'm part of. When I mentioned just now that, a few minutes ago, that when as a kid, I could go in any direction and ride as long and hard, and I did. And the depth of experience was so powerful. And now over the years, property, property's been bought up, the continuous line of, you just can't ride, you can't go. And so in a sense, the land has become a reservation. It's a nice reservation. It's, a square mile of land out in the middle of some pretty wild country. But and then I try to explain to younger generation who are connected to the land what we're missing and why. And then I'm arguing often why we want to preserve what we have, and their experience is the land is a lot, and how much land do you need? And here I am arguing with people who have a deep connection. They have a deep connection to the land, but they're not aware of something else. And that's a problem all of us face. I mean, we face it as well in our generation. Every generation faces this. The problem is it goes one direction. It's a corollary of what you just said with, in a sense, the technology. The technology goes one direction, increasing sophistication and pervasiveness in society. But unfortunately, on the nature side, it goes in the other direction, which is increasing degradation.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned about the shifting baseline, and that's exactly what that is.
I try to give voice to more wild aspects of our interactions. And, when I was starting out, a lot of the debate was between kind of the wild wilderness people and the more urban nature, domestic nature people. And so there'd be a lot of, what do you call it? Just that was the debate at the time of whether people arguing for wilderness, and is it a social construct, and is there really such a thing as wilderness or wildness, and the importance of the urban. And then I saw over the years that the domestic, local, everyday nature started winning out. And part of it was that the environmentalists themselves had come of age with more urban nature. They've already shifted. And so when they are now leading the environmental movement, they start moving away from more wildness, to more urban nature. And so the very notion of the shifting baseline that we just talked about, you can see how it's now impacting the large social movement across a generation, across generations, because the environmentalists themselves are, should I say, if I can say, many are too tepid. They grew up in too domestic of an area and are shaping the discourse in that way. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, okay, that's the way it is. And now in the last 5 years, you can see it even shifting more, because you can see kids now coming of age so tied to their devices, so much in inside environments, that the debate now has shifted from wild and domestic to nature, to outside nature, versus kids self-identifying and saying, no, I'm an inside sort of kid. I don't need to go outside. I'm inside. And so the distinction is shifting now to inside versus outside, and outside becomes nature and inside becomes largely tied to devices. Now that's a fast shift. If you talk about human evolution and how quickly it's shifting.
Yeah. And then people's argument is, we'll adapt. We're adapting. This is, it's the norm. And you think about ancestrally, how many thousands of years we lived in exactly the right environment for us to thrive. And how, if the entire, history of the human species was a book, 300-page book, the last page would be, civilization, and the last sentence would be the modern day. It's insane. I know. Yeah. Amazing. Is it enough to teach? No, I'll answer that. We need to be interacting with it, right?
Yes.
It's I was reading a book called The Magician, the Warrior, Lover, the Poet. It's about archetypes and about masculinity mainly. I mean, it's definitely for men. and it talks about the two crises of masculinity. It talks about the lack of coming of age, the lack of coming of age, so that experience transition from boy psychology to man psychology. So the lack of that in our cultures, which directly is represented by our interactions with the land, the nature that we would be in when we have those experiences, the coming of age, you know. So it's an interesting concept, definitely.
Does it connect to Robert Bly's early work from decades ago? I mean, it seemed like, do you know his work,
Not
Robert Bly?
familiar, no, not familiar.
Okay.
So yeah, and the other, the lack of the conflict in the hierarchy of men and women, and that conflict that's been it's been happening for so long. So yeah,
Tell me about that conflict.
well, the patriarchy, essentially. The patriarchy that's possessed a lot of control and a lot of rebound, essentially, and a lot of backlash and a lot of like rise of the feminine, and what that's doing to men in their role in society now, and how men are essentially questioning their role. They don't know it anymore, and it's come under threat, and there's a lot to think about, and to discover about ourselves and what it means to be a man. So yeah, but back to the nature thing. The thing I mentioned that because the coming of age and that transition from boy to man, it would generally happen in a natural setting. Whether that's, you know, getting all your friends together and going off on a hike, a couple of days, and you talk about important conversations, and you kind of, you know, you discover who you are a bit about yourself, especially when you climb a mountain. I mean, you figure out who you really are and what you're really made of. You know, you get into nature and you start to understand what you're capable of, what your potential is, and where your place in the world is. And it's really important. It is the most important. And I think we're seeing it now. Like it's quite interesting, and I want to touch on this. Like with COVID happening, with the pandemic, I've seen two extremes. I've seen the extreme one end of how affecting it is on people's identities, on people's livelihoods, and without their job, without their what they perceive as identity, they almost don't know who they are, and that their world crashes down because so easily our societies have fallen slightly, and industries have fallen, and it's caused people lots of depression, lots of anxiety, and of course rightly so. Your future is uncertain. But then I've seen another extreme where people just generally fade towards nature and just generally gravitate to those natural spots, and they begin reconnecting with the natural world. So it is interesting. And living near the beach, I get the dose of that. You get the people who have not been in the sea ever, you know. I mean, it is cold, understandably, but I've seen more and more people, the more time on their hands, they feel into what their body wants. And with that time comes, you know, a natural remembering of, oh, I do enjoy going out for a walk. That really does mean something to me. And that time on their hands. So it has a lot of this does tie in with the time that we've got in the day, and where we think we're going with this perpetual progress, and we must go forward, you know, and improve on the last year, and how unsustainable that is. Sure, we could talk about that, but what it's doing to our health and our connection with the world.
Yeah, those are important issues you're raising. There two. I'd like to respond to 2 points that you raised. One, the very large, important issue of patriarchy. And uh, one response to that, that I think about is that it does not go as far back in our history as we think it does, or many of us might have thought. At least in my reading of the record, it's just not, patriarchy was not part of Paleolithic life, of the hunter-gatherer life. If you look at people like Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, who in 1950s first contact with Bushmen in Africa, and she and her family spent a year living with them, and then others, and then they more time as well, other years they spent with them. And you start understanding hunter-gatherer life, if those tribes were representative of who we were 50,000 years ago. What you saw was not any patriarchal relationship. You had hunters and gatherers, so you had differences in their capabilities and contributions to the whole, but equal power, different types of power. In some ways, Thomas talks about the feminine power being stronger than the masculine.
Yeah.
And so then where patriarchy starts happening is in as we move then from hunter-gatherer to domestic Neolithic period with agriculture. Once you have agriculture, now you don't have to be nomadic, so you can increase population. You have population growth, you get control of food. With control of food, population increases even more. At that point, you start needing hierarchical systems, because the numbers are increasing. And according to Eisler and others in their reading of the archaeological record, it looks like there are two pathways that humanity embarked on in broad strokes. And one is a relational one, where people still needed to be some hierarchy, but there was still no patriarchy, equality, different powers within some hierarchical framing because the numbers increased. And sometimes those cultures are referred to as like goddess cultures or something, some matriarchal powers there. Another line was hierarchical, but also domination oriented, a domination warfaring line that also had patriarchy deeply embedded in it. Largely the domination orientation has more rather than less taken over across the globe. It's not pervasive, but there's a general way in which that has happened.
Yeah.
And why it has, that's another story. But given that it has, what one can see now is patriarchy tied to a worldview of not simply hierarchy, but patriarchy tied to domination. And that's a domination of people over people, but also people over nature, very similar orientation. The point I want to go back to is that this is fairly recent. I mean, it's like 5,000 years old, 8,000, whatever, 3,000, depending. Agriculture took hold in different times, but it's not deep in our genetic nature for us to have patriarchy as embedded in society and as part of like male identity. And because it's not that deep, I think it can be changed in an easier way than other types of our characteristics. So that's very optimistic. We can change. And notice then what I'm connecting is that the patriarchy is connected to something deeper, and that's a domination. And that's the part that needs to change. When I look at like the United States, right, and the political President Trump, who will no longer be president soon. I mean, Trump is about domination, people over people, people over nature, one group against another group. It's deep, it's pervasive, it's ugly, it's destructive. And we need to change, and we can. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is super interesting because I've just finished Chris Ryan's book. You familiar with Chris Ryan's work with Sex at Dawn? It was quite an interesting actually book. So Chris Ryan is, yeah, he's kind of fits into all what you're talking about, really. His first book, Sex at Dawn, talked largely about sexual relationships and intimacy in hunter-gatherer societies, and it really sparked, in my opinion, a kind of a curious look at, okay, what is love, and are we meant to be in these polyamorous polygamy relationships? Like, what is the, I can't remember which way around the one is, polyamorous, polygamy. So Chris Ryan talked a lot about that in hunter-gatherer societies, and that partners, they would interchange, and no one would really know who's father of the child in the tribe, because they'd all share that responsibility of the children. And when the men would go off to hunt, who knows who's coming back? There's always a chance that one wouldn't come back, so they would want to know that all the males in the tribe would look after the kids if that would be the case, if one doesn't come back. So that was his first book, talking all about that. And his second book, Civilized to Death, does unwrap this kind of story, the NPP, which he talks about, the never-ending perpetual progress, and the story that we're told, really, of like about ourselves, which I think is interesting in terms of what we're kind of told through the mainstream narrative, largely in the West, about societies breaking down, or like COVID happening, and the shops were, we're gonna face looting, we're gonna have anarchy, and anarchy really just means that we'll govern ourselves. It doesn't necessarily mean reckless behavior. You see that in Greece. I went to Athens a couple of years ago, and it is anarchy there. There's self-governing underground society of people that just move, squatters, and just move around, lots of immigrants, etc. But it's not chaos. They're self-governing. But it's have you ever heard of the Disaster Diaries? I can't remember his name, but he talks about in disaster, whether it's natural disasters, whether it's wars, they are the best time to live, because everyone looks out for themselves, everyone looks out for other people. So to conclude that point, I'm basically saying that humans are good-natured and they don't necessarily need large centralized governments to dictate and to leave them feeling a bit dependent on them. And if they didn't have them, or the police or the local services, then, and it's a big conversation, of course, but if they didn't have those structures in place, then we'd all be running around and savage. The in the core of us humans is a savage being, when it's not necessarily the case.
Yes. No, I think the savagery is recent. You can even see in Jared Diamond's early work where he says agriculture is the worst. Wrote a paper something like agriculture is the worst problem in human history.
Yeah.
And part of it is it's through agriculture and the rise of population that you end up with this domination orientation where savagery emerges. You had skirmishes earlier, but you didn't have savagery. And part of what you're highlighting too is in in our ancestral history. You kind of alluded to this with the hunting scenario, is everyone's needed in a community. Everyone's important. And a loss of somebody is a loss to the entire tribe. And warfare then is very dangerous for the continuity. And if you think of the Bushmen in Africa, they were a sustainable culture for 50, 100,000, 100,000 years. There's no, if you talk about a measure of sustainability is how long does a culture last, and you realize they've lasted 100,000 years till they hit modernity. That's just an amazing, that's an amazing success. And part of their success is tied to cooperation, not savagery, cooperation. And so cooperation is deep in our ancestral heritage. And I think that's part of what you're pointing to.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think we live a lot in our heads these days. And I think it's important to intellectualize these and to really rationalize with these subjects, because we then think, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I do feel that is, within me. And if it's within me, it's within, other humans. it's
Yeah.
it's it's kind of, I don't think we can escape it now. Our societies are set up so much that we do think a lot. The Western way is that, you think, therefore you are, and that is your approach with everything. It's literally what most people think. They think they are their thoughts. They think they are what they think. But anyone who's delved into a bit of psychology, that definitely can unwrap that and understand you're definitely not. You are much greater than that. I did want to ask, because I know you draw upon it in few of your writings. But are you spiritual? Like, what does spirit mean to you?
Mm. There's so many directions to go with that.
And all of the right ones, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's. I mean, one starting point is just to continue the conversation. We live too much in our heads, and um, the thinking mind. It's a beautiful part of who we are, but it's just one part, and it's a part that, as you've just highlighted, has superseded so much of our lives and our consciousness, and in largely maladaptive ways. And you think of the difficulty we have with minds that are hurting ourselves, rumination. We endlessly think about things from the past that are unpleasant, or we play over the conversation that we had from yesterday or from childhood. I mean, or we're worrying about the future, and endlessly going over problems that can emerge. And it's not healthy. And so that, in some sense, from a Western side, now some notion of mindfulness literature has, come forward, of trying to be present more in the moment. Well, I think that's a Western way of trying to open up consciousness to something that's beyond the thinking mind, but still not it's highly conscious. It's actually more conscious. And the possibility for that is, I mean, this with, like with astrophysics or something. I mean, the world's not what we think it is. Time and space. I mean, Einstein talks about a time-space continuum, as if our minds the minds don't really understand what a time-space continuum is. When we talk about a black hole, that's hard to grasp. When we talk about a big bang and everything started from something, what is it, like a billion times smaller than an atom? What does that mean, right? And then faster physicists talk about multiple universe existing side by side in a way that doesn't have time. and, and then you ask about spirit, as if spirit is tied somehow to a religious. See, if we connect spirit to a religion, all of a sudden we got all the dogma and theology, and at that point we're right back to our minds,
Thinking,
right?
yeah.
I'm going to think about it. I'm going to have an argument. I'm going to identify with my position, and my position is, in whatever religion or subfield of the religion it is. And now we're going to argue ideas, which isn't spirit at all. Yeah. So, the Lao Tzu begins the 2,500 years ago is speaking on Taoism, the Tao, and he says the Tao, the spirit, in a sense, let's call it spirit. The Tao that can be spoken of is not the true Tao. And now we're left with, how do we use words? to of course Lao Tzu does, right? Okay, so he talks about a cup, a vessel, clay vessel, and he says, right, that this is constituted by what it is, the form, and what it isn't, right? The space, form, formless. And he's using this as an analogy to try to speak about the universe is constituted by both what is and what isn't. And that's in Taoism, similar ideas in Buddhism. And in a sense, you could bring that very idea into consciousness and think that in our minds, there's both the form, that's thinking, that's the content, and then there's the formless. And that's the space. That's the space between ideas. And there it is, form and formless. And when you make the Descartes move, I think, therefore I am, and the thinking, and then the identification with the thinking and the rumination, that's so much form. And what we need is a balance. On a psychic level, I think we need a balance between the form and the formless. And so that's speaking as a psychologist, and then speaking more as a philosopher or metaphysics in terms of what reality consists of. It's where do you go?
Yeah, it blows my mind. It's amazing. I think that was a perfect answer. I do. I think that was a perfect answer, because there's so much that we do not know, and just to sit in that space of the unknown. And yes, let our heads wander if they want to, but just admit that's the answer to me. It's the more I know, the less I know.
And it's from a Western standpoint, it might be seen as admitting, but it's reveling in the presence of a vast mystery.
Mm-hmm.
And then we live in form as well, and then we get to enact, we get to be, and that's beautiful to have our bodies and minds move, express, and there's almost like an expanding universe. There's an expanding self. It's beautiful for individuals to express and expand.
Mm-hmm. How do you express yourself other than with your words?
Express by oh, so on the form side, yeah, I love using my body. Just, you were mentioning hiking and getting to the top of a mountain or something, and
Mm-hmm.
we're embodied. We have bodies, and the bodies are so beautiful, and to be able to use one's body in relation with the natural world. And as we were talking about, it's like we're so marvelously calibrated that way.
Yeah.
So to just walk, run, climb, lie on ground, walk along the water, swim in the water, all these ways of just immersing one's body. And in some ways, for me, and I think for many people, those forms of interaction help the mind settle and find, in a sense, that formless, the form and the formless. How do you find the formless? Well, you can try to think about it. You can try to do it mentally. You can do mindfulness practices or meditation practices and so forth to try to calm the mind. But this whole other side of nature is that nature does it so easily for us if we have the nature to do it with. And that's part of a conservation agenda, is we need to be conservationists and protect nature. So in order to have a nature to interact with, a healthy planet, healthy selves, in a sense, it's like, and the nature, when you interact with it it engages the mind in so many diverse ways. From a health level, we started speaking about, well, nature and health, but it's also nature and human flourishing. And then the larger move that you were also making in the very beginning was you just saying, well, we're part of nature. And so that very separation starts giving ground. And when your body, for me at least, when my body is involved, it's so easy for the mind to not identify with itself and to expand into the world I'm in.
Yeah.
And so that's when you asked me, what's an expression? It's like, well, these are beautiful ways to express.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking a lot about observing then, and that is one thing that meditation is a tool for. It does tend to help you observe things, just sensations, what neither good or bad. That's
Mm-hmm.
one thing that it's radically taught me how to. It's an invention, like whether something is good or bad. We label things, we label them, and that is interesting because it ties into conservation. Our human, you know leading with the head and not with the heart. It's we tend to label things as good and bad, or we'll put the good bits of nature there, the good what it all is. It all is, and labeling things doesn't tend to serve us.
Right. Well, it's also the limitation of the domestic form of nature. When domestic natures, you take the nature, excuse me, you take the nature that's kind of bunny, rabbit, sweet, and call that nature. But you take the hardship out. But sometimes it's the very hardship that strengthens us, challenges us, and helps us find new spaces, of consciousness and personal growth you were mentioning earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nice. Now, how does this tie into the future and what is to come in technology and nature, and using technology to, perhaps integrate what is good for us?
Mm. Well, yeah.
Big question, and it's something you can't conclude on. There's a lot of speculation. There's lots of knowings of what's to come, but how it's going to impact us and how quick or how far ahead in the future some things are.
I think that technology is outstripping our wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
Technology almost goes back to our shifting baseline discussion. The technology keeps building on itself, exponential growth. Kurzweil talks about exponential function of technology, and when he's writing his book, The Singularity. But he's right about the exponential growth. And you take $1 and double it every day. After a week, you have $64, which is not that much. But after a month, you have over $1 billion. And we're at that knee of that exponential curve where the technology is doubling very quickly. And yet, when you think about our wisdom, it goes back to the construction of knowledge, the environmental generational amnesia idea that we were talking about, where each generation needs, not only are they constructing their view of nature, but they're needing to construct their own, their moral understandings. And so they start all over again. And it's now they're constructing understandings of social and moral relationships in a world that technologically has continued to get increasingly sophisticated. So now and pervasive. So if you think of kids coming of age now, not just with not very much nature, but with technologically mediated, simulated, and augmented experiences of nature, well, that's a whole nother world, right? And that, think of them, kids coming of age with VR nature, living in more virtual reality rather than actual reality.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, I've got I have a body of work of 20 years of research on the psychological effects of interacting with different forms of technological nature. And so that was my book, Technological Nature, Adaptation and the Future of Human Life. So, I mean, your question is kind of right in the wheelhouse where I've been working and thinking for 20 years now. And Yeah. Something gained, something lost often. I think we understand the gains of technology, but we are rarely understand the losses. Uh,
Hmm. Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's it feels to me as if we're here to birth the technology, where that's the first monkey grabbing a stick and knocking a banana out the tree, you know, that was the first technology, whether that was, it feels like that's what we're here to do. It's so bizarre when you really, you know, tune into it. I think that it feels inevitable. We want to, it's our innate desire to you know, make things more convenient, make things easier, and it feels like we're here to give birth to the robot, you know. And
I don't know.
it's
You know, in some ways, it's the same move I would make on the patriarchy move of just asking the question, how far back does it go? And I
Mhm,
think the innovative mind that you're referring to is not part of Paleolithic mind. And that's part of what led to this enormous sustainability of a culture for 100,000 years or more, is there was very little innovation. It's true there was, arrows and mortar and pestle or something, but very, very little innovation over, say, 100,000 years. And it's really with the rise of agriculture that modern mind takes hold.
mhm,
So modern mind is not that old. Like, again, let's just call it 5,000 years old, 8,000 years. And that's when the mind starts changing and innovation starts taking off, and technological innovation. So yes, we've always been a technological species, but something really astonishing has happened in the last, 5 to 8, 10,000 years. And that's the exponential function. And it's in that sense, it's out of control. So we could frame it as, well, that's our destiny, but it's also maybe not. Maybe
mhm,
it's something that's an aberration that needs to be checked. And it's not who we are, not in the way we're unfolding it now.
mhm. Yeah, touche. Because as soon as you said that, I started thinking about the tribes that exist and are on our planet now, and where are they at, and what are they striving for? They're content with their day to day leisure time and hunting for food, and they are the natural template, right?
Mm.
So it is interesting where a fork in the road happens, and that picks up pace.
Well, then, as you say, we can't go back. That's like your
Hmm.
statement of iPhone 6, and now what are you going to get an iPhone 3? No, you're going to get an iPhone 12. So you don't go back, and so then the challenge that we face is how be to honor, give voice, expression. You're asking me, how do I express myself or something?
Hmm.
Well, how do we express our technological love, love of technology, innovation, the innovative mind, with all of the issues that we've been bringing forward today, tied to the deep parts of human life and human flourishing and human spirit. And that's in some sense the challenge. Human depth of, you're talking about masculinity or femininity, and depth of who we are and who we can be, depth of social relationships. And where does that technology, how can it assist with that? And then how does it prevent it or stunt it? And then the third option is, how does it, in some sense, create a new us, new ways of thinking, that our mind, the modern mind, it's not stopped developing,
Hmm.
evolving. We're still evolving, and there's ways in which the technology's changing our very minds. And the kids coming of age now, as they construct who they are and their identity and their understanding of the world, as they interact with the new technologies, they are constructing understandings that are different than our understandings. And so you can see the mind itself starting to change. But it goes back to your question about adaptation. Is some of these adaptations are to our benefit. Some are just different, and we'll become a different species. But some of these adaptations, and I think many of them, are actually harmful. And we adapt, but we adapt and we hurt ourselves. And we started our discussion about nature and health, and you can just see the disease that we have on a worldwide level is enormous. It's incredible. I mean, I can't fathom it. If we just talked about, in the United States, 1 in 10 people are taking antidepressants. 1 in 10. And some people have said that number is actually, it's greater than that. You know, you look at the cancer rates and the ADHD rates and the number of people with illnesses over the course of a year. It's a disease society, and yet people are if we were just looking at this fresh from another planet, we come to this earth, we would just say, this is sick, this is madness. Paul Shepard years ago wrote a book, Nature and Madness. This is insane what we're doing. We're sick, we're diseased. But this is also the shifting baseline problem. We're born into this world and we think this is normal. And we can say, well, it's sad, it's unfortunate that people have all these illnesses, but that's just the way it is. And it's not the way it is. It's not the way it has to be. It's the way that we've adapted. And in the adaptations, we are suffering. So when you ask the question, you know, about adaptation, we have to ask, well, what's the baseline? And is it just in our lifetime, or is it based on who we are and who we can be? To understand whether those adaptations are just neutral, helping us, or hurting us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's always on my mind. It is ingrained in the work that I am and wanting to do and be a part of, because one thing that does get to me and is a pure example of that is when you walk. This is in England mainly. I'm not sure it's like in the US. You have these road signs and you have elderly crossing, and you have 2 elderly people. They've got their walking sticks, you know, elderly people, they must be old. They've got walking sticks and they're hunched forward. That's a road sign. And I'm thinking, that's the baseline. That's how you should look if you're old. You should have a walking stick and you should be hunched over. Absolutely not. I don't think that is what's normal. But it is. It's such an amazing example of what we perceive to be normal for us, to be old and have to be on all medication to keep us alive. Oh, of course, everyone else is taking it, and it's happened for my grandfather had heart disease, and his grandfather, it's hereditary.
Right.
Okay, how far do you want to go back before heart disease was really uncommon?
Right. You know, just obesity, you know, in the United States, I think a third of people are obese, 2/3 of us are overweight. I mean, that's insane. It's that's not a healthy society. And yeah, so you can say, well, we've adapted to a more sedentary life, and you think, okay, well, let me show you some of the implications of that, and of those adaptations. I mean, you put elephants in a zoo, they adapt, they live long lives, often. And they go half insane, and neurotic, and I mean, and violent, and end up with PTSD. I mean, Gay Bradshaw, you know, amazing person and author, and has a sanctuary in Oregon in the United States, and she's put that on the map of the PTSD of elephants, and so yeah, so we are in effect. We're in effect caging ourselves, like we've caged animals in a zoo. We're caging ourselves. We are building our own prisons. We're prisoning ourselves in these enormous things called cities. Yeah. Especially the mega cities, right? I mean, there's scale. There's an issue of scale here, right? You can, certain level of cities are wonderful. Cities are this creative energy, this amazing intermix. It's like jazz. It's like all these new ideas. This is part of modern mind. You can see, in a sense, how, when I go back to the evolutionary story and I talk about the Neolithic period and agriculture and the rise of population, and all of a sudden modern mind changes, you can just feel how it happens, right? Because you just feel the jazz of people, and all we come together, we mix, we come up with new ideas, and we're often running in new directions, new art, new science. It's so exciting. It's so beautiful. It's a wonderful part of who we have become. I don't think it's who we were, but it's who we've become. And then it's like the same way I've talked about the technology, all of a sudden something happens that starts spinning out of control. Similarly with the cities and people, it starts spinning out of control. And now we're not talking about 5,000 or 50,000 or even 500,000 people in a city. We're talking millions of people, 10 million, 20 million people, 30 million in some cities. And we're moving more and more from country to city to urban life. Well, with that density, where's the possibility for the nature that we've been speaking about? If we need deep connection with nature, and yet we're building the very infrastructure that pushes nature out and urban hardscape in with that level of density. But we're doing it to ourselves. And this is why I go back to the very problem that we started with, that you asked me about, which is the problem of environmental generational amnesia. We're not recognizing what we've lost, how important that is, that deep connection with nature. We're losing it. We're losing the well springs of human existence, which I was speaking about earlier, and we don't know it. Well, we know it's hard to fix a problem, big problem, even if, like, climate change, like, who knows if we can solve that, but we're in agreement that it's a problem. Most of us are. But how do you fix problems when you try to explain to someone what they're missing and they look at you and they say, Peter, I don't think I'm missing anything. Things seem pretty good. That's a hard problem.
How much a part do you think our political systems have to play? Capitalism, for example, and that's, a shared belief that, you can. That's the way that the function of society, of the system that we are a part of. How much do you think that has a part to play in our degradation of nature? Because it's one thing that's, well, it hasn't happened too much, that you kind of commodify nature too much. There's not too much profit in restoring life and making sure. I mean, you have nature reserves, but I've got a friend who lives close by who's doing a marine biology course, and she was part of a big, 3-day conference that were talking about implementing more systems and profitable, because they have to be, business systems that are capitalistic and that they can put in, and then they start coming up with fancy terminology of how they can induce and really, because it's not enough to reserve nature anymore. We really need to be actively making sure it is being planted, it is being looked after, it's being kept wild. So yeah, in that mix of words, if you can decipher something, how much do you think it is a part to play?
I just thought you articulated some good ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because to me it feels like you need to. It's all about creating business, and the economy is such the mainstream narrative, isn't it? It's how do we grow? How do we create more wealth? How do we get more people rich, essentially? And that's the driving force of our culture. It's not really health. Health is certainly not the fundamental narrative and driver of our culture. It is the economy. It's on everyone's mouths, everyone's lips, everyone that leads and runs the country. And and now we're facing this big issue with the degradation and just complete, just
Yeah.
brick wall that is the system that is causing the planet to turn.
I mean,
The planet's doing fine. It's been through a lot worse. Humans are fucked.
yeah, in some ways it goes back to our discussion of Lao Tzu and the form and the formula. And part of what political systems help drive is a human tendency to give a lot of attention to the form. And then that gets translated to, more things, material wealth. We could reduce that to I need more money. If I just had another $1,000, then I would be happy. Then you get it, and well, maybe 2,000. No, make that 5,000. and and it's the focus on form versus this other quality, this other dimension. Let me put it back to the word you used about spirit, but whatever you want to call that quality of human consciousness, where without that, I don't see where the balance lies. Obviously, we need material things, but without that piece that transcends that form, we're left with just wanting more and more. And every time, and it's like, and then you get it, and then you want more because it satisfies for a short period of time. But the very nature of that form of happiness is that it doesn't satisfy for long. And so then you're asking it to do more than it can do. And once that happens, that's partly driving the political system. So maybe I'm just, I mean, maybe this is me, the psychologist, not the political theorist, because in some ways you framed it as a political theory question, and I don't have a lot to say about political theory. But I do think the politics is partly working on the humans, is only driven partly by the human psychology. That is, and the same on the technology. Then you can say, well, the technologists are, foisting on us all of this technology that we don't need, and that's partly true. But it's only successful because there's a part of our human nature that is so drawn to that. And you can say, the same thing on with, why has President Trump in the United States been so successful as a politician that he can have 74 million people still vote for him after 4 years in office? It's not, obviously it's his capability, and in however you frame that, but it's a capability based on the human psychology of the very 74 million people that are voting for him. And it wouldn't work without that. So I think different lines of analysis are important. I'm just highlighting that even at the political theorist line, you need to ask, what's the nature of human nature?
Yeah. Absolutely. Right. I'll respect your time, sir. Thank you very much. It's been a super fun conversation.
You're marvelous. You're putting out such important podcasts, and your line of thinking is vast and beautiful. And I'm just very appreciative of the work you do, and have been really honored to get to speak with you a little bit.
Thanks.
Hope our paths cross in future months and years.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm thinking about doing a tour of America when I can, and just see the people who I've interviewed in the last year. A little podcast tour, a little take two. Yeah, thanks, man. I really appreciate your time, and more so all the work that you're doing and have done. Like it's fascinating. It cuts deep with me because it resonates, and it's where I want to spend my time and energy, because I think it's the most valuable questions. It's the most valuable thing we can look into for the future of us, our kids, and everyone else. So yeah, man, I appreciate your time.
It's been great. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thank you so much, man.
it.
All right, take care.